Let us now move on to learn about various functions of the cerebellum. Three basic functions of cerebellum include maintenance of equilibrium, muscle tone, and coordination of the movements. For a movement to be coordinated, timing of the movement has to be right and the amplitude and direction of the movement has to be right. Now this is what is done by the cerebellum. Cerebellum exerts temporal control through two mechanisms. The first one is the feedback inhibition of the granule cells by the Golgi cells. Second one is the sequential excitation of the Purkinje cells by the parallel fibers. As we know, once the parallel fibers reach the molecular layer, they bifurcate into two branches. Each branch will then go on to excite or make synapse with 500 to 1000 Purkinje cells in a row. So the first few Purkinje cells are excited much earlier than the last few in the same row. Cerebellum exerts spatial control through the feed-forward inhibition, which is done by the stellate and the basket cells in the molecular layer. They ensure that a microzone of Purkinje cells are excited, whereas the surrounding Purkinje cells are inhibited, what is known as lateral inhibition. This will result in neural sharpening, which will be translated as precision of a movement. While the vermis of the cerebellum maintains balance by bilateral control, the cerebellar hemispheres maintain coordination through ipsilateral control. Now coming to various parts of the vermis and hemisphere and what function they are involved in. The vestibulocerebellum, the parts of which are named with red color here, along with the vermis, are involved in maintaining balance, posture, and eye coordination. When we say posture, basically cerebellum is controlling the muscles of the trunk and proximal limbs. The spinocerebellum, parts of which are labeled here with blue color, that is involved in maintaining the muscle tone and limb coordination. Here we are talking about the muscles of distal limb. Then the pontocerebellum or the neocerebellum, parts of which are named with black color here, that is involved in motor learning, planning, and memory. Cerebellum is also involved in anticipatory action that helps in postural stabilization. Let us see how it works. Let us say the cerebrum is intending a voluntary movement that displaces the upper trunk away from the center of gravity, like in case of pulling a book down from a shelf. Now cerebellum receives this information from the premotor area via the corticopontocerebellar fibers. Now anticipating this postural displacement, cerebellum ensures proportionate contraction of the postural muscles of the lower limb or lower body, that is the muscles of the legs, thigh, and the lower trunk, so as to keep the center of gravity in the midline between the feet. So the first muscles contracting when you are pulling a book or any heavy object down from a shelf are actually not the muscles of the upper trunk or upper limb, but they're actually those of the lower limb, mainly the gastrocnemius and soleus. So action of these lower limb muscles stabilize the posture in anticipation. Cerebellum also receives vestibular input regarding the position of the head and sends appropriate output to the vestibular nuclei so that the extensor antigravity thrust is exerted through the vestibulospinal tracts. Actually, the vermis is involved in this anticipatory action to maintain the upright posture. So damage to vermis results in loss of this anticipatory action. In such cases, the trunk will sway in the direction of reach and a person may even end up in a fall. This is what is known as truncal ataxia. Now, anterior lobe is also involved in anticipatory action, but that is in response to the gravitational effects produced by the locomotion. This control is mediated through the cerebellar output to the reticular formation and then through the reticulospinal tracts. So damage to the anterior lobe will also result in loss of anticipatory action, but that is in response to locomotion, and that will result in gait ataxia, where the patient reels to the side of the lesion or exhibits a classical cerebellar staggering or drunken gait. Cerebellum is also known to be involved in postural fixation. Let us say you ask a patient to extend the wrist and maintain it in the same position for 2 seconds. Now, extension is done by extensors of the wrist, but when the person is holding the wrist fixed in the extended position, if you take the electromyographic recording, it shows not only the contraction of the prime movers, but also contraction of the antagonist muscles. So the electromyographic records showing this alternating mild contraction of the antagonist and the prime movers is described as shivering ping pong. If the prime movers were to be contracting alone, very soon spontaneous tremors would set in because of the viscoelastic property of the muscles. Instead, this alternating contraction of the antagonist and prime movers will not only help in maintaining the fixed position of the joint, but it will also prevent the onset of tremors. This postural fixation or freeze is actually maintained by the posterolateral part of the cerebellar hemispheres. So any lesion to the lateral lobes will result in disruption of this postural freeze, and that will result in the onset of classical action tremors or the intention tremors. Cerebellum is also involved in motor learning, which is mediated through the olivocerebellar climbing fibers. We have discussed this in detail while we were studying the connections of inferior olivary nuclear complex. Now, inferior olivary nuclear complex is located in the upper medulla. It receives information regarding the intended movement via the cortico-olivary input. It receives information regarding the executed movement via the spino-olivary input. It receives information regarding how the cerebellum is coordinating the movement via the cerebellar output to the red nucleus and then from the red nucleus through the central tegmental tract. So if there is any error in the executed movement in relation to the intended movement, or when a new movement is being learnt and the movement has to reach precision, this olivocerebellar pathway becomes activated. These climbing fibers will excite specific Purkinje cells through a complex spike, which will alter the behavior of those Purkinje cells and correct the errors. So this whole pathway becomes activated whenever a person is learning a new activity, like learning to play a musical instrument, or for the medical students, it could be learning how to dissect in the first year or learning suturing techniques in the later years. This activity will last until the gap between intended and the executive movement is bridged. In recent years, it is also known that cerebellum is involved in higher functions like speech. The functional MRI has revealed that the right-sided cerebellar hemisphere is active when a person is doing functional naming, not object naming. When I say object naming, it's like talking about pen, book, spoon, or bicycle. Whereas functional naming would translate as writing, reading, eating, or riding. So whenever a verb or an action is being named, the right-sided cerebellar hemisphere becomes activated. Please note, the right-sided cerebellar hemisphere is connected with the left-sided cerebral cortex, which is the dominant hemisphere controlling speech in most of the people. So cerebellum basic functions include equilibrium, muscle tone, and maintaining the coordination, but it is also involved in postural fixation, postural stabilization, motor learning, and some of the higher functions like speech. Thank you very much. You can visit the site for other neuroanatomy videos. Thank you.